Between July 1976 and July 1977, there were 8 random shootings all around New York City, different boroughs. 7 people were injured and 6 were killed. And there was absolutely no clear motive at first. The police were completely baffled, and the public was just petrified at what was happening. On July 29, 1976, the first shooting took place. 18-year-old Donna Lurie, an emergency medical technician, and 19-year-old Jody Valenti. The first bullet killed Donna instantly, and the second hit Jody in the thigh. The man then stood up and quickly walked away. Jody survived and was able to describe the shooter to the police. He was a white man in his 30s, about 5'8" and 200 pounds. He was pale with short, dark, curly hair. But what was odd was that the shooter seemed to have no motive. He didn't try to sexually assault the women or rob them. A few months later, on October 23rd, 1976, it happened again. 20-year-old Carl De Niro, a Citibank security guard, was hanging out in a bar when he saw his friend Rosemary Keenan, an 18-year-old Queens college student. But everything happened so quickly that neither of them saw who the shooter was. And again, it seemed like the shooter had no apparent motive. But since it happened in a different borough, there was no reason for them to link it to the first shooting. And again, the investigation just went nowhere. And then just over a month later, on November 27th, 1976, there was another random shooting in Queens. 2 high school students, 16-year-old Donna DeMasi and 18-year-old Joanne Lamino. Donna had been shot in the neck, but was able to make a full recovery. Joanne, on the other hand, was shot in the back. She survived, but she was permanently paralyzed. And based on their description, the police were able to make a composite sketch of the suspect. Just like the shooting in Queens the month before, there seemed to be no motive. Why was this guy running around and randomly shooting people? And on January 30th, 1977, the shooter struck again. 26-year-old Christine Frond, a secretary, and her fiancé John Deal, and she died several hours later in the hospital. John survived with minor injuries from the shattered glass, and the police still had no idea why. At this point, the community was starting to feel on edge, because they were like, who's this madman running around shooting people point blank? And the police still had no suspects and no motive for the shootings. But then on March 8th, 1977, there was another shooting in Flushing, Queens. Virginia Voskerichian, a 19-year-old Columbia University student, was walking home after her last class of the day. And while she walked, she was suddenly confronted by a man with a gun. She had been shot point blank in the face and killed instantly. But detectives continued to tell the media that they had no reason to think it was the same shooter. But then the ballistics came back on the bullet that killed Virginia, and there was a match. The gun used in this and the previous shootings was the .44 caliber Charter Arms Bulldog. So they knew it was time to tell the public. The police held a press conference on March 10, 1977, and they announced that they believed the same .44 caliber pistol had been used in multiple shootings. They were looking for suspects at this point, multiple suspects. They released composite sketches of the blonde man who shot Donna DeMasi and Joanne Lamino in Floral Park, and the man with dark curly hair who shot Donna, Gloria, and Jody Valenti in the Bronx. The NYPD formed a 200-person task force called Operation Omega, run by Deputy Inspector Timothy Dowd. The media coverage exploded after this press conference, and local newspapers were competing for the most shocking headlines. And the more graphic the coverage, the more issues they sold. And soon the story was making headlines around the world, and the press nicknamed the shooter the .44 caliber killer. Meanwhile, New Yorkers were terrified to leave their homes. No one went out alone. On April 17, 1977, just a little over a month after the police press conference, the next shooting happened. 18-year-old Valentina Serrani, a Lehman College student and aspiring actress and model, was with her boyfriend, Alexander Sau. She had been shot in the head and died instantly. Alexander had been shot twice in the head as well and was rushed to the hospital, but he died the following night around 9 p.m. For the first time, the shooter left something else besides bullets behind. A hand letter was left at the crime scene. The shooter referred to himself as the son of Sam and said he was commanded by Father Sam to go out and kill. The full letter wasn't released to the public, but the media learned the killer's given identity, and the .44 caliber killer was quickly replaced with the son of Sam. And everyone was on edge, even more so than before. They also theorized that there was a possible satanic connection. Just days later, on May 30th, 1977, a columnist for the New York Daily News, Jimmy Breslin, received a handwritten letter from the son of Sam. There were multiple strange new nicknames throughout the letter as well, like the Duke of Death, the Wicked King Wicker, and John Wheaties, rapist and suffocator of young girls. And it was signed, Sam's Creation, 44. The most alarming part read, "Tell me, Jim, what will you have for July 29th? You must not forget Donna, and you cannot let the people forget her either." Donna Loria was the first murder victim, and the first anniversary of her death was coming up on Friday, July 29th. The police were desperate for answers, but they seemed further away from finding the truth than they had ever been before. The killer didn't wait until the anniversary to strike again, though, because the next shooting took place on June 26, 1977. 17-year-old Judy Placido, a recent high school graduate, and 20-year-old Sal Lupo. But neither of them saw the shooter. However, 2 witnesses saw someone running from the scene. He was a tall man with dark hair. 1 year and 2 days after the first shooting, July 31st, 1977, the killer struck again. Stacy Moskowitz, a secretary, and Robert Volante, a clothing store salesman, both 20 years old, were on their first date. Robert lost his left eye and was left with just 20% of his vision in the right eye. But 38 hours after the shooting, she died. She was the 6th victim killed by the son of Sam. Several witnesses saw a yellow Volkswagen in the neighborhood before the shooting, and several could even describe the shooter. Police were able to release a new composite sketch, which looked like a completely different person than the previous sketches. Here's the police talking about the new sketch they released.
We are distributing today the new composite drawing of the 44 killer, provided based on descriptions provided by witnesses to the shooting on July 31st. The description is as follows. Male, white, 25 to 32 years old, 5'8 to 5'9.
Investigators theorized that he was wearing a wig, since his hair color had changed, and the length and texture as well, with each shooting. The media speculated that there were 2 or more killers, but the police just kept on insisting that they were looking for a lone gunman. After Stacy's death, the pressure to solve this case was intense. The police departments and politicians were feeling pressure from the public, and people were losing faith in their ability to stop the killer. In August, just a few days after the last shooting, they finally got a break in the case. 4 days after the shooting, another witness came forward who believed she saw the shooter. Cecilia Davis was out walking her dog on July 31st. Shortly before Robert and Stacy were shot, she saw an officer ticketing cars on the street.
A man come towards me, and he looked me straight in the face. He looked at my dog, and right here, we crossed each other. So he had his arm straight down. He had a long thing, like a bell, sticking up his sleeve. And he made a left turn.
Detective James Justice was tasked with checking every parking ticket from the area that night. And he found a ticket from Cecilia's neighborhood for a 1970 four-door yellow Ford Galaxy that belonged to 24-year-old David Berkowitz, a postal worker who lived in Yonkers. On August 9, 1977, James called the Yonkers Police Department for help tracking down David. The dispatcher who answered the phone identified herself as Wheat Carr, and she knew David because he was her neighbor. August 10, 1977, they found his car parked on the street. They looked inside and saw a gun on the floor in the back seat. Also inside the vehicle, they found a duffel bag with ammunition, maps of the crime scenes, and strange cryptic notes. And as David went to go get into his car, the police surrounded him. And one officer asked if he was David Berkowitz. And David just smiled and said, "No, I'm the son of Sam, and you got me." And as he was arrested, he just kept on smiling. He was also calm. Around 1 a.m. that morning, the mayor announced that the man they believed to be the son of Sam had finally been arrested. Here's the mayor speaking.
I'm very pleased to announce that the people of the city of New York can rest easy this morning because of the fact that the police have captured a man whom they believe to be the son of Sam.
Well, what was extremely odd during this confession is that he explained that he had been ordered to murder by a 6,000-year-old demon who lived inside his neighbor Sam Carr's black lab named Harvey. The police in the city of New York celebrated, though. They didn't really think twice about David's confession. All they knew is that, we got our guy. He confessed to the murders, case closed. New York City is safe again, and everybody could finally stop living in fear. In fact, David didn't look like the most recent sketch at all. And all the sketches still looked like different people. So some people started speculating that, maybe it's not just David that was the killer. Maybe there's others out there responsible for these slayings. But investigators quickly dismissed concerns that David Berkowitz had any accomplices. David was indicted for 8 shootings that killed 6 people and wounded 7, and he was sent to stay in the psych ward in Kings County Hospital. And there he underwent 3 intense mental health examinations to determine if he was competent to stand trial. And crazy enough, his defense team used the escalation of his violent behavior and his claims about demonic possession to build an insanity defense. They claimed that he was a paranoid schizophrenic who lived in a separate reality in his mind with the demons that he had created. And the isolation and break with reality caused increasing tension that was only relieved by an act of violence. When neighbors and coworkers were asked about him, they described him as a nice, pleasant man who mostly kept to himself.
I think he was a nice man. He always spoke to me, said hello, how you doing? He was very nice, kept to himself.
We worked together for about 2 or 3 months, and we sat and had coffee together, and he did a lot of reading, liked to read, I think mostly novels,
And David did not really help himself as far as, not looking like an absolute psycho killer, because at his sentencing hearing 2 weeks later, he actually lashed out at officers, kicking and even biting them. He then lunged toward the windows and tried to jump from the 7th floor courtroom. His sentencing was delayed pending a psych evaluation. After this outburst, there's no doubt in anyone's mind that David was guilty of these crimes. Despite this carefully orchestrated insanity defense, David ignored the advice of his attorneys. On May 8, 1978, he pled guilty to the 6 murders and over 1,400 arson charges. And despite his guilty plea, prosecutors still had an uphill battle to get a conviction. Because they broke into David's car without a search warrant, none of the evidence they found in there could be used in court. The trial took place in June 1978, and David pled guilty and was sentenced to 6 consecutive life sentences. A maximum security prison in upstate New York, where he spent the next decade of his life. While still at Attica, he became an evangelical Christian and asked God for forgiveness for his crimes. He rejected the name the Son of Sam and prefers to be called the Son of Hope. And he started leading a Bible study group and counseling fellow inmates. His supporters run a website for him to chronicle his religious conversion, ariseandshine.org. And while in prison, David graduated with honors from Sullivan Community College. He also writes essays for Christian websites and contributes to projects for psychology, criminology, and sociology students. And the terms of his guilty plea allowed him to be eligible for parole after serving 25 years. Before the first hearing, he sent a letter to the governor asking for it to be canceled because he deserved to be in prison for the rest of his life. And David has never asked to be released. Many people believe that this is the end of the story. The Son of Sam murders were committed by a lone gunman who is now in prison for life, and justice has now been served for the victims and families. So we can close the case and move on. But there might be more to the story, because a few weeks after his arrest, David was allowed to send a letter to the media. And in this letter, he said, "There are other sons out there. God help the world." The police dismissed the possibility that David had accomplices, and for the most part have refused to consider any alternative theories about this case. The case of a lone gunman may go much deeper than just David Berkowitz, as there is credible evidence that David was just a small pawn in a much larger game. A worldwide conspiracy centered in the occult, satanic rituals, and murder plots designed to bring chaos and destruction, and ultimately, the apocalypse. So it's very possible that David may have just been the guy who took the fall for a much darker and sinister circle of individuals known as the Sons of Sam. Maury Terry, who was basically a New York journalist, and he went digging very, very deep into this, and he was actually the one that really found a ton of evidence for this idea that, David Berkowitz was most likely probably not a lone gunman in these crimes, and that in fact, there may have been multiple gunmen, and perhaps multiple gunmen a part of a satanic cult that could have spanned the entire country, or even further than that. So if you watch this docuseries, you're going to be blown away at some of the things that they've uncovered from the work that Maury Terry did. I mean, he literally dedicated his life to this case, so much so that when he died, he sent all of the evidence, all of the research, all of the papers that he collected over the years to have somebody else pick up where he left off, because this could be a mystery that still could be going on to this day. The main problem with the theory that was put forth by the police and by the justice system was that the description of the shooter from eyewitnesses that were there that saw him changed drastically from one crime scene to another. And this sketch looks nothing like the previous three. So Tommy Zano and his girlfriend were parked in front of victims Stacy Moskowitz and Robert Vellante that night. And Tommy got a good long look at the shooter while he was standing in the park. Tommy watched the man walk up to Robert's car, shoot, and then run away. And he later said that there was no way the man that he saw running was David Berkowitz.
He looked like he was in good shape, because after he fired the shots, he took right off back into the park fast.
The police then created a sketch based on Tommy's description. But the sketch was never released to the public. And investigators theorized that the shooter wore different wigs at each crime scene and dismissed other changes in descriptions as eyewitnesses just getting the details wrong because of them being in a stressful situation. So all these things, I mean, one person can't alter all these different things. I mean, you can't alter your jawline, you can't alter your height.
No.
One consistent detail from eyewitnesses was the presence of a yellow Volkswagen Beetle. David Berkowitz drove a yellow Ford Galaxy. I don't know how anyone would mix these up, because a Volkswagen Beetle is like one of the most, or Bug, is one of the most distinguished looking vehicles of all time, I would say. There was also a problem with the timeline of the last shooting. Robert and Tommy both saw the shooter lingering in the park at 2:20 a.m. A witness named Cecilia Davis came forward a few days after the shooting, saying she was walking her dog Snowball about 2 blocks from the crime scene and saw David at 2:30 a.m. And the shooting happened at 2:35 a.m. So David couldn't have been the man in the park. NYPD detective turned investigative reporter Jim Mittiger befriended David while he was in jail. And David sent him a note that said, "There are other sons out there. God help the world." So despite all that, the police still did not investigate the multi-shooter theory at all. So if David didn't act alone, who were his accomplices? Witnesses from the first shooting described a man who looked just like David's acquaintance, John Carr. John's father was David's neighbor, Sam Carr, which would make John the actual son of Sam. Sam's daughter, Mickey Faye Carr, nicknamed Wheat, worked as a police dispatcher. When an officer called about David's parking ticket, she helped connect him to the Son of Sam shootings. There were clues in the Son of Sam letters that alluded to the Carr family as well. One letter named John Wheaties, rapist and suffocator of young girls. John's middle name was Wheat, and John Wheaties was one of his nicknames. John lived on nearby Wicker Street, and the letter also named the Wicked King Wicker. According to other neighbors, Sam Carr was an abusive father. He beat both of his sons, John and his younger brother Michael, and even locked them in the attic to punish them. So interestingly enough, after David gets arrested, John Carr moved to Minot, North Dakota, and he'd actually lived there in the mid-1970s after serving in the Air Force, but he was in New York during most of the Son of Sam shootings. When he moved back, he stayed in a housing unit at Minot Air Force Base with his girlfriend. But soon after he arrived, he went to see a counselor and said he thought someone was trying to kill him. He also said he had information about the Son of Sam shootings, but a short time later, John was dead. On February 17, 1978, Deputy Glenn Geetson, after hearing a gunshot from the inside the house, John's girlfriend led Glenn to a back room where he found a bloody scene. John was lying dead on the floor. He had been shot in the head. His death was ruled a suicide, but it definitely took place under suspicious circumstances. Michael Carr also died under suspicious circumstances. In October 1979, he was in a fatal car accident on Manhattan's West Side Highway. It was a single car accident, and the police report noted that the scene looked suspicious, as if someone may have run him off the road. So one of the really interesting things about the Son of Sam letters is that they had lots of references to both Satanism and the occult. And there were rumors in Minot that John and his friends were involved in witchcraft. Apparently, they allegedly held secret ceremonies near their housing unit that involved killing German shepherds and drinking their blood from a chalice. An acquaintance actually saw John drawing a strange symbol on a phone book. It was identical to the Son of Sam symbol. The Minot police heard the rumors that John was involved in cult activities, and for weeks the officers sent verified reports and evidence to the Brooklyn DA's office, and they expected that someone from the Son of Sam task force would look into it, but literally nothing ever happened. And journalist Maury Terry, which really did the deep dive investigation on these alternate theories, believed that this referred to an area of Untermeyer Park in Yonkers, New York. And he actually published a series of articles in 1979 refuting the lone gunman theory. And he would later conduct interviews with David Berkowitz and write a book about the case called The Ultimate Evil. A trail to Untermeyer Park was directly behind Sam Carr's house. Locals referred to it as the gutters or the sewers. And inside the abandoned aqueduct, Maury found dead animals, including dogs that had been mutilated and shot. There were even rumors that the bodies of 2 young boys were buried near the house. And in the early 90s, the man claimed someone had ordered him to dig up bodies back in 1967. People had heard animals screaming in pain around the area, and had even found a beheaded German shepherd and another with a missing ear. Built into the side of a hill was the pump house, a stone structure with small door leading to a poorly ventilated room, and was nicknamed Devil's Cave. Inside Devil's Cave was a platform that looked like an altar. The altar was surrounded by graffiti, including white supremacist and neo-Nazi symbols, the number 666, inverted pentagrams, paintings of Satan, and the same symbol used to sign the Son of Sam letters. There were multiple reports of cult rituals being performed there, and a teenage girl was even kidnapped from the path and raped. Witnesses reported hearing chanting and seeing candles, torches. During multiple court depositions, David admitted that he was part of a cult with John and Michael Carr, and he claimed the brothers had been killed in order to keep them quiet. And this cult called themselves the Children, and had a special interest in sacrificing German shepherds. After David was convicted, a retired detective named Kevin Murphy tried to interview people involved in the cult activity. A man named John Paul, who went to high school with John Carr, agreed to talk to him, and he actually said that John tried to initiate him into the group when it was still fairly innocent. But eventually, things took a dark turn. He confirmed that the group started torturing and killing animals and participating in drive-by shootings. John and Michael may have gotten involved with cult activity through Scientology. Michael had joined Scientology to help with his problems with addiction, and he ended up becoming a high-level member of the church. The link between Scientology and the occult is the Process Church of Final Judgment. The Process Church was established in London in 1966 by Mary Ann McLean and Robert de Grimston. And they believed a person could gain enlightenment by worshiping the 4 parts of God: Jehovah, Christ, Lucifer, and Satan. Eventually, Christ and Satan would become one entity, and this would trigger Judgment Day and the end of the world. The way to reach Judgment Day was to bring together good and evil by causing violent chaos. Members of the Process Church believed the apocalypse would happen in their lifetime, so they were fully committed to spreading violence and destruction across the world. They actually sent groups to multiple cities in the United States, including San Francisco, Los Angeles, New Orleans, and New York City. The children were allegedly one of the offshoots tasked with committing crimes to spread chaos. Around the same time, there was a ritual murder at Stanford University in California. A 19-year-old newlywed named Arliss Perry was murdered and mutilated in a church on campus. Campus security guard Stephen Crawford reported that he found her body on the morning of October 13th, 1974. In 1979, David Berkowitz mailed a book to Deputy Sheriff in Minot, North Dakota from prison. The book was The Anatomy of Witchcraft, and in the margins, David wrote, Arliss Perry, hunted, stalked, and slain, followed to California. In 1981, David Berkowitz wrote a letter mentioning the murder, and the Santa Clara police decided to interrogate him about it. A few years before, another inmate had actually slashed David's throat, and he almost died. So David refused to cooperate with an investigation against his attacker, and he refused to talk to the Santa Clara police about Arliss Perry's murder. He told them that if he named the names, people on the outside would kill his father.
Yeah, that's a scar, yeah. When I went down to the infirmary, the doctor there who stitched me up said it was a miracle that I lived.
Arliss Perry's murder wasn't solved until 2018 when investigators matched DNA found at the crime scene to the security guard who said he had just found her body, Stephen Crawford. And when police officers arrived at his home, he locked the door and shot himself. Maury Terry, he started diving into this, and he really was the one who connected the dots between the Carrs and Berkowitz, and then made the connection to the Process Church of Judgment. And from there, he started making a bigger web and just realized how deep this really went. I mean, there's so many people all wrapped up into this web and from the web of different individuals. So there was this guy named Ronald Sisman, and he was a photographer who was murdered with his girlfriend, Elizabeth Platzman, on Halloween night in 1981. Prison informant named Jesse Turner told the police that David Berkowitz knew about this double murder before it happened, and that the Process Church had actually ordered the hit, which was footage of the murder of Stacy Moskowitz in July 1977. Ronald was the camera operator that night and was tasked with filming the murder. The film would then be sold by the cult to the highest bidder. So the person that may have been the highest bidder of this snuff film was allegedly Roy Radin. And Roy was a wealthy business promoter and theatrical producer. He had been shot in the head and the body was mutilated beyond recognition. Later on in 1993, though, David had a spiritual awakening apparently and became an evangelical Christian. That year, in 93, he agreed to meet with Maury for an in-person interview, as he was ready to share details about his crimes publicly. And during this interview, David said that he had always been fascinated by witchcraft. In 1975, he met some people at a party who took him to Untermeyer Park for a ceremony. It was there that he witnessed an animal sacrifice, and it just absolutely horrified him. But at the same time, he was also fascinated and wanted to learn more. He then was eventually coerced and convinced to join a group, a satanic cult called the Children. And during the initiation ceremony, he took a blood oath to be loyal to the group and to serve Satan. And in order to do this blood pact, he had to provide pictures of his family members. And he was told that if he ever betrayed the Children, his family would die. David provided specific details about the shootings and the people involved. He said at every shooting, there were multiple accomplices. In addition to the person pulling the trigger, 2 to 4 others served as lookouts or getaway drivers. There were usually at least 2 vehicles involved.
Did you do all of them?
I was at all of them. I was at, more or less at all of them, scouting the areas and reporting back on likely targets and things. And I did not pull the trigger at every single one of them. And I believe the police do know that.
Carl De Niro and Rosemary Keenan, who were shot in October 1976, had only survived because the shooter was a woman who wasn't used to a .44 Bulldog. John and Michael Carr had also been shooters at one point too, and they each resembled the police sketches almost to a T. John had actually shot Donna DeMasi and Joanne Lomino in November 1976. A Yonkers police officer and cult member was also there that night. An outsider was brought to New York by the larger organization for the January 1977 shooting that killed Christine Frond. The last shooting in July 1977 was also done by an outsider. He also said Ronald Sisman, the photographer who was murdered with his girlfriend, had been there that night, filming the whole thing. But he agreed that Arliss Perry was murdered by cult members. Because even at this point, in jail, he's still very careful about what he's saying about the process church. Killing an innocent person was considered the ultimate sacrifice for the Children. It was another kind of ritual that they were all required to participate in. The story of this interview spread like wildfire, and every reporter in the country was talking about the new allegations from the Son of Sam killer and the possibility of more shooters being out there, as well as a cult conspiracy and possible cover-up. Some were angry and believed David was lying, including the NYPD officers and everybody on that Son of Sam task force. The NYPD then held the largest promotion ceremony the city has ever seen. John E. Douglas, a former FBI profiler, interviewed David for several hours, and he concluded that David definitely acted alone. Maury's goal, though, was to get the case reopened this entire time, so he wrote the book. He believed that there was multiple accomplices running around living life and were never brought to justice. And he pushed extremely hard, but unfortunately, that never happened. There's clear evidence that there's multiple people that was involved in these series of shootings, yet nobody was ever looked at other than David Berkowitz. But at the same time, I see the flip side argument is like, well, maybe it was just David, because if it had been just David, why didn't the shootings continue? So to kind of wrap this thing up, the investigations were criticized for taking so long to link the shootings and for waiting to inform the public. And the police assumed that the shooting of Carl De Niro and Rosemary Keenan in October 1976 was a drug deal gone wrong. And by making the victim a suspect for superficial reasons, they wasted time and could have been spent investigating and linking the cases.
Because of my long hair at the time, and because of the low crime neighborhood, they kind of jumped to the conclusion that it was a drug deal gone bad. So for 6 months, I basically had to defend myself to my mother, because my mother believed the cops.
Carl De Niro, Rosemary Keenan in Queens. That wasn't you. Were any of the 44 shootings done by females?
Yes. One I know of, possibly two. And I know that Carl's was definitely a woman.
Berkowitz refused to name any living co-conspirators for fear of reprisals against his family. But De Niro may have an idea of who she is.
All indications point to a female who was in the cult. She's still alive. She would be 71 years old now.
Who do you think shot you?
I'd rather not say.
Multiple detectives and former detectives dedicated hundreds of hours to reviewing all the evidence they could get their hands on, and they presented all their findings to the NYPD. All they wanted was access to the rest of the case files to continue the investigation. Yet every single one of their requests has been denied.